Okay,
don't reason analytically. That's
you're gonna
it's
kill.
bad for
You're
you.
gonna kill somebody.
Okay, but this was actually in Forbes.
This is in Forbes, yeah. All right, we're back with the manipulation check. How's it going, Dan?
Oh, it's going very well. And you?
It's good to see you. It's going pretty good with me too. So today we got a topic we've been kicking around for a while. We've been thinking about these ideas for a while. And over the past, 3 years, we're coming up almost on a 3-year anniversary. It's another anniversary discussion at the beginning of our podcast here.
Ooh, the pandemic this time.
The pandemic anniversary, not nothing to do with our anniversary. that was before. We got the 3-year anniversary coming up. Maybe it's already passed. I'm not sure. I guess it depends. But over the past 3 years, one of the things I think we can think of or we can recognize is there's been this sort of tension, or you can maybe even think about it as a battleground or a war, even if you want to be sensational about it. We can be sensational on podcasts, right?
Absolutely.
So there's tension between like these basically almost like two camps, but there's been a discussion or an issue around what is rational, what is reasonable, what is logical, what is right, but ultimately like what is reasonable and what is rational. So to try and make things more concrete, we can think of examples where you see somebody, people have probably seen this, driving alone in their car with a mask on. And some people may say that's completely reasonable, rational behavior. They went through some decision-making process and they arrived at that decision. That's totally rational. Other people would look at that and say, you know what, that is completely irrational. That doesn't make any sense. And based on this other reasoning, process and procedure, that doesn't make any sense at all. You can apply it to policy. So for example, somebody may institute a vaccine mandate in their workplace. And the person instituting the mandate may say, you know what, I've reasoned through this. This makes sense, and this is a very reasoned and well-positioned policy. Somebody else, maybe working at that organization, may say, you know what, I'm going to refuse to comply with this mandate and have a very well-reasoned position to refuse. And who's being reasonable, what's reasonable, one side calling another side unreasonable, irrational, illogical, and on and on and on. So this idea of how do people come to reasoned decisions that are in disagreement with each other. So there's basically different ways we can reason, different ways we can apply rationality, and we're going to talk generally about that today.
Yeah, and there's a very specific feature about the COVID situation, which is that there was a lot of uncertainty. And there's actually whole literature that looks at how people make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And maybe I'll just start with a little bit of a background, Jeff, because this work comes from actually two different fields effectively coming together over time. And these are the fields of economics and psychology. Now, in the literature on economics, human reasoning and decision-making is typically compared to a gold standard, which is characterized by a person making optimal choices to maximize their benefits, and the benefits particularly for themselves, okay? And the person who is such a decision maker, who's always optimizing reasonably to maximize benefits for themselves, is called the Homo economicus. Homo economicus, or in other words, economic man. This economic man, makes decisions based on cold, hard, statistical, mathematical information, primarily to maximize gains and minimize losses for oneself. And I think it's fair to say that for a long time in economics, this was the main assumption that dominated economic theory. And the basic idea was that people were these optimal examples of a Homo economicus. This is how people made decisions. They were very rational about how they made decisions. But this view completely changed with the development of a field called behavioral economics. I think we mentioned it in the Nudge episode. And this field of behavioral economics was heavily influenced by Nobel Prize winners Daniel Kahneman, and I think he was from Princeton University, but he also spent some time in Canadian universities, I think University of British Columbia, studying psychology actually before he went into the whole economics domain. And his partner in this work was Amos Tversky from Stanford University. And they showed that people sometimes make judgments not using pure reason, but using what they called heuristics, which are rules of thumb or reasoning using shortcuts. You're not doing a whole logical deconstruction of a problem to arrive at a conclusion. You're using rules of thumb and these reasoning shortcuts. And also, Kahneman and Tversky showed that people sometimes demonstrate that they have systematic biases. So, in other words, people sometimes behave, when you compare it to the economic man, irrationally. And Dan Ariely, I think, had that book, Predictably Irrational, because it's not just randomly irrational, but there are these systematic biases and heuristics. So you can actually predict how irrational people are going to act. So there's systematicity to it. So he had the title of the book was Predictably Irrational. So maybe let's just give some examples of these heuristics and biases that people have. And one of the examples that Kahneman and Tversky had in their paper, and by the way, I recommend a paper, it was published in Science, I think I have it over here, it's called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. So it's very relevant.
It's all
right?
there.
Yeah. And they identify some of the key heuristics that they had uncovered. And one of these is called anchoring and adjustment. And here's a description from the Science paper. Quote, in many situations, people make estimates by starting from an initial value that is adjusted to yield the final answer. The initial value or starting point may be suggested by the formulation of the problem, or it may be the result of a partial computation. In either case, adjustments are typically insufficient. That is, different starting points yield different estimates, which are biased towards the initial values. We call this phenomenon anchoring. So this would be a systematic deviation from pure rationality. Like you should just be doing the mathematics and coming out with the same answer or with the right answer, regardless of how you anchor people. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And there's a very classic example that people always use. And basically, participants are shown a sequence of multiplying numbers, and they have to come up with the product of those numbers. And they might be shown two different sequences, or two different groups might be each shown a different sequence. And one sequence might be just multiplying a series of numbers from like high to low. So 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And you have to figure out what the product is. And the other group might be given the sequence, but the exact same numbers, and multiplying, but in the reverse sequence. So 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 and so on to 8. And of course, it's very difficult for you to do the multiplication in your head. I don't know if you could do it, Jeff. Can you have the answer?
I can't do it.
Right. So what you have to do is just estimate. You have to sort of guess at it.
Yeah.
And in this case, the two strings I mentioned, they have the exact same product because it's just the same numbers multiplied in reverse order. But people, the key finding and the surprising finding is that the product that people estimate is typically larger for the sequence starting with the larger numbers than for the sequence starting with the smaller numbers. So the initial numbers somehow anchor you and will determine your final answer. So again, it's a bit of an example of irrationality, and this can happen systematically in various different contexts. You can come up with all sorts of experiments, that being just one of them. And I have one more here, Jeff, and then maybe you can share some as well. The other one that Kahneman and Tversky discuss is called the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic. And here's a description of this heuristic from their paper. There are situations in which people assess the frequency of a class or the probability of an event by the ease with which instances or occurrences can be brought to mind. For example, one may assess the risk of heart attack among middle-aged people by recalling such occurrences among one's acquaintances. So there is another kind of bias that has been very well documented in the literature. Do you have some, Jeff, that you want to share?
Yeah. So it's an interesting point of distinction is in the work that you're outlining, Dan, there's the view that the heuristics are responsible for the bias, that the heuristics are the things that sort of lead people astray. That if they didn't use these heuristics, they'd be better off, right? They'd be more rational. They'd come to the correct answer, come to the more economic, rational decision, right?
Correct. Yep. That is a typical assumption. And that's why Dan Ariely titled his book Predictably Irrational. It's kind of seen as irrational type of thinking.
Yeah. So if you deviate from that gold standard, let's say you're behaving in an irrational way.
Yeah.
A researcher we've talked about on, I think, a few previous episodes, maybe one previous episode, is Gigerenzer and some of his colleagues. Mm-hmm. And he has a sort of a different view or different approach to heuristics. And, generally speaking, to oversimplify things, his approach is generally that, heuristics aren't necessarily bad and aren't irrational, that they can actually be quite useful and quite effective and quite economic when it comes to making decisions. Mm-hmm. So his definition of heuristics is very similar to the one that you mentioned, Dan, but it's a little bit more. I don't know. I think it's a little bit more. I don't know how to describe it.
Generous to the human.
Yeah, that's a good way to. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So. The definition that he uses, or that I've seen him use, is it's a strategy that ignores available information. So I see that as almost like a more neutral, descriptive, but almost more precise, I think, perhaps definition, where it's like an almost it's strategic. It has like a strategic element to it. It's not maybe not like a default knee-jerk kind of thing. So I think it's maybe less. I could be projecting myself, but it feels less pejorative. Mm-hmm. That you're using a strategy that's filtering out, ignoring information, and focusing on just a few key pieces of information. Yeah,
I like that positive frame. Yeah, definitely. Certainly, Kahneman and Tversky started out with a rather negative frame.
Yeah,
and so this is much better. I like it.
Yeah. So so he studies, he studied heuristics and in a number of domains and the accuracy of heuristics, and he has a few. So these are more, I would say like, not really classically, but they're more in line with like they're heuristics, not necessarily biases. So these would be heuristics that don't result in bias, but maybe result in effective decision making in certain contexts. And a few of them, just these some off the shelf ones that he's written about or talked about or studied, or other people have as well. One, for example, is the recognition heuristic. So if you're faced with two alternatives and one is recognized and the other one isn't, then you go with the one you recognize, or the one that's recognizable, because you can infer that's going to have some higher value. So there's some underlying reason why you recognize it. There's some process or some ordering that results in the recognition, and as a result, that simple rule can be applied to making a decision between two things. Pick the one you recognize. And I think that's even been studied in, I could be wrong here, in examples of like betting. I think even sports betting, where you get somebody who's totally naive to the situation. You ask which team's going to win.
It's the one you recognize.
The person might pick the team, the more popular team, or maybe the team that has the more. Maybe there's like a really well-known player on one of the teams that the person would recognize. So they recognize, oh, that person's the quarterback. I know who that person is. I think that team's going to win. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's something even like that old adage about multiple choice tests, right? Where it's like go with your first
instinct.
Is that one, right? So maybe that's a heuristic.
Maybe, yeah.
Other ones include. This is one that's pretty relevant for our current situation, is imitate the majority. So determine the behavior followed by the majority of people in your group and imitate it.
I guess that one would be effective because there might be a reason why the group is behaving in a certain way. You might think you don't have all the information that they have. And so therefore it's just, when in Rome, do as the Romans do.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Another one related to that is imitate the successful. So determine the most successful person and imitate his or her behavior, and so on. So there's another one that's quite interesting in the context that we're going to be talking about, is the default heuristic. So this kind of lives a lot in, I think, the nudge ecosystem, where the idea is if there is any kind of default setting, just go with that. So don't deviate from the default. Go with the default. Presumably there's some reason for the default, and so on. So and there's others, but these would be some that have been, researched, and it depends on. These aren't necessarily. What's interesting about Gigerenzer's work is he's basically got this theory about it's called ecological rationality, and the general idea, without getting too in the weeds on it, is that it's not that all these heuristics are equally applicable to all situations. They're going to be equally effective in all situations. But there's kind of this matching that happens between the environment and the heuristic. So that under certain situations, depending on what the characteristics are with respect to number of options, degree of uncertainty, other considerations, that certain heuristics may be preferential to others. And there can be this matching between the environment and the choice of heuristics that's going to lead to effective, rational, correct decision.
Yeah, and the Gigerenzer view, I guess, is that generally we use these heuristics because they're actually effective in the real world. Many times they lead to a good result, especially under conditions of uncertainty. But I guess then the way you connect that with the Kahneman perspective is that sometimes the situation is set up that the heuristic no longer is an accurate match to the situation, and that's when you're going to make an error. And the Kahneman-Tversky group sort of kept focusing on the error situation. It created all these lab scenarios where they make people make errors or predispose people to make an error.
They present this kind of low-hanging heuristic that's going to lead to the wrong decision. So you get people to jump at that, and that leads to the wrong decision. You say, oh, heuristics, not so good.
Yeah, so according to the Kahneman-Tversky kind of literature, you'd think that we were just hopelessly irrational and there's nothing we could do. And they would argue that that's because there's some sort of there are these built-in processes, whereas Gigerenzer would say, no, actually these things are functional, but they can be exploited, and maybe nudges to some extent might be connected to the exploitation of these kinds of heuristics and biases that we talked about in the previous episode. But that people though can also be educable, that they can be educated to recognize, hey, this context my heuristic doesn't apply. I should apply more systematic reasoning. So those would be the kind of the two opposing views in the literature on this issue of heuristics and like imperfect reasoning.
Yeah, just one thing to add on into the heuristics conversation is that one of the key characteristics or key advantages of these heuristics is that they're simple, they're easy, they're quick, they're economical. So it doesn't require a lot of computation, a lot of horsepower, a lot of energy, and they can be executed quite easily and readily, which is interestingly connected to what you said about how people can learn these heuristics. Because if you want to you could teach these heuristics very, very easy because they're actually ultimately by definition quite simple.
And
it's not going to require
them
a lot.
And teach them when they're applicable and when you should not apply them. That's also a kind of a key feature. In fact, what you're saying here about heuristics not requiring a lot of cognitive energy can bring us to the main sort of class of theories that have been developed based on a lot of this work in behavioral economics. The class is called dual process theories of judgment and decision making. And the basic idea is that decisions are made by relying on two cognitive systems that are quite different from each other. So there is, and this is kind of a vague notation, system one, just system one, which is fast, automatic. So it's a fast and automatic system that uses intuition and heuristics to make decisions. So that's the heuristic system. And then there is system two, again, not very descriptive, but system two is the slower, controlled system that uses rational analytic processing, and this system requires limited cognitive resources. So system one does not require your limited resources, but system two does require these limited resources. And the basic idea is that both systems are often used when making decisions, but sometimes we tend to rely on one of those more than the other. And in some cases, we'll rely more on system 1, the fast heuristic system, and avoid using system 2, the analytic system. And in the wrong situation, if that occurs, this can lead us to make errors in judgment. That's the basic idea. And those of you who are interested in reading about this, there's a very famous book written by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's got another one out right now, another book, but that's a good one to read. And then if you really want to learn a lot about heuristics and dual process theories and biases and so on, there's this book as well. It's titled Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases, and it's an edited volume by Kahneman, Paul Slovic, and Amos Tversky. So that's another one that people might want to take a look at. Okay, so Jeff, imagine we could apply this dual process model to people's reasoning during COVID. So I'm thinking maybe we should try to generate a dual process account of decision-making during COVID.
Ooh.
Do you want me to take a stab at that?
You started off.
Okay, so here's my thinking. So at the beginning of the pandemic, and then maybe during the main part of the pandemic, many people might have relied heavily on system 1, which is the heuristic-based system.
Heuristics, okay.
Rather than system 2, which is the analytical system. And in some cases, this might have been very effective, but in other cases, it might have led to poor judgments because people might have failed to carefully and logically think through the problem.
Okay.
So the idea here is that maybe people, even when they think that they're being logical and making rational decisions, are actually using a system 1 heuristic-based approach. So let's.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, don't want to cut you off.
Yes, I'm just thinking. Let's try to apply some of the heuristics that we talked about, and maybe some others, to the pandemic.
Okay. Because we talked about how heuristics aren't necessarily irrational, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So their consideration would be, okay, so there would be, if somebody was using system 1, using the heuristic system, then maybe there would be some heuristics that would have been better than others.
Yes, that's very likely. That's right. And in some cases, the heuristics would have maybe helped you. In other cases, they might have hurt you, right? Or
Right.
Heuristics that were very useful in many other situations might have now led you astray in this context. So let's start with the availability heuristic. Let's try to apply that one. So how might the availability heuristic come into play or have come into play during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Right.
And here's my thinking on this.
Yep.
Or do you want to give it a shot?
No, you go ahead.
So I think that throughout the pandemic, what we saw was this endless presentation from the media of the increases in the number of COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, together with the presentation of images and videos about people suffering. Right. So what we had was people in hospital, and there were even ads run like this, right? By maybe some of them by government, people wheezing, and they've got the thing in their nose with the air, and this is a person under COVID. This is what happens when you get COVID. So when you're inundated with that kind of imagery and those kind of statistics, when you think about COVID, what comes to mind?
Yeah. Sickness, illness, death, severe. Yeah. Sky is falling.
That's right. And so that's what's available. That's what's available.
Yeah. What's not available is somebody getting it and getting a mild case and maybe recovering and going about their life and no big deal. That's not available.
Exactly.
That picture is not.
Or all the people
that picture's not there.
That picture's not there. Or the people who get the virus and experience absolutely no effects from the virus, right? Because they might have prior immunity or whatever. They might have their physiology might not respond very much to the virus.
Yeah, there's no mental representation for that scenario.
That's right. So then you imagine that most people are going to die from COVID or be hospitalized. And in fact, I have a Gallup poll.
Oh, yeah.
I have this Gallup poll here. Yeah, this was in September 2021. And it showed that, quote, most Americans overstate the risk of hospitalization from COVID. 92% overstate the risk that unvaccinated people will be hospitalized. And 62% overstate the risk for vaccinated people. So the poll also found that, quote, 41% of Democrats replied that at least 50% of unvaccinated people have been hospitalized due to COVID-19, end quote.
That's not even early. That's post-vaccine rollout.
September 2021. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the idea there is that these people obviously, like, what makes you come to the conclusion that 50% of the unvaccinated people will be hospitalized? Mm-hmm. Well, only if every thought that comes to mind about unvaccinated people is an image or a statistic or a claim.
Right.
Remember the claim, this is going to be the winter of death for unvaccinated people?
Yeah.
So, like, in your mind, if you're unvaccinated.
So that was just a heuristic. That was a consequence of using a heuristic, maybe.
Yeah. So you're using the availability heuristic, and maybe the media and government were actually exploiting that heuristic. Because if you think about it this way, they could have done the opposite. They could have calmed everybody down by showing people just playing and, oh, somebody got a cold and they're fine. And that's then we would be like, oh, it's just COVID. Yeah. It's just another. It's just right. It's not that bad. It might be worse than the flu, but it's not that bad. Yeah. But that didn't happen. The opposite happened.
Yeah. You even got this scenario where, even when, let's say, it wasn't that bad. So you get these stories. I remember hearing some of these stories. You get these stories about how somebody tested positive, and then they get shut in the basement of their house, and they get basically put in lockdown in their house. And that creates, so even if there was no symptoms, asymptomatic even, let's say, that paints a very, very severe picture in terms of how it must be serious if somebody's locking their kid in their basement and sliding the food under the door. Like, that's serious.
Yeah. Or
even when the symptoms aren't serious. Or like there was no necessarily mention of wheezing or suffocation or anything like that.
Yeah. And, if you think about, like, how severe is this pandemic, and you think about, well, how are we responding to it as a society? And all that comes to mind are barriers and arrows and the fact that you have to stay at home and masks and like, you're like, oh, the earth is falling down. We're all going to be devoured by this virus, right? Mm-hmm. And it must be true because look at like everything I see is giving me the signal that this is really bad.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. It's right at the top of everybody's mind.
Yeah. The other one that might play a big role in terms of assessing the severity of the pandemic might be anchoring. Yeah. The anchoring and adjustment heuristic, right?
What comes to mind with anchoring is right away is the models.
Yes. Which model in particular?
Well, the model.
The model, the Imperial College.
The Imperial College, yeah. So coming out with the big numbers, right? With the projections of death. And right away, so that's going to give you that number. That's going to set that expectation for what you're going to expect, what you're going to predict, how you're going to act, how you're going to behave. Mm-hmm. So big number coming out, big numbers, country specific, so on and so forth. And that sets the frame that sets the anchoring for, how bad things are going to be. And there really wasn't a counter to that. So it was one direction, and it was extreme out there on the tail.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I have a quote here actually from, maybe this is Nature, I'm thinking. One of the articles, the model, quote, in mid-March predicted a total of more than 500,000 UK deaths from COVID-19 and more than 2.2 million in the United States if no action was taken to stop the virus spreading in those countries. So that's crazy, right? So the basic assumption is that these prognostications might have a very particular effect because they might serve as anchors. Mm-hmm. And then even when data comes along that shows, hey, maybe this is actually not as bad, you're not going to have that many deaths, people fail to adjust, which is the whole problem with using this anchor and adjustment kind of heuristic. So people have trouble adjusting appropriately, and then you continue to think that this is more severe than it actually is. And the other one, for instance, is, especially when you start to age stratify it, right? Then you learn about the age stratification, which initially was never really mentioned. Right. And then you realize, in most of these age categories, except for the extreme old, it's even lower than what people. It's much lower than kind of the what people are talking about. And you just fail to then lean into those numbers. You just keep getting anchored by those initial, very severe prognostications.
Right. And it may not even be all or nothing, right? So it could be that you hear about this information about, let's say, age stratification, and you are integrating it, but your expectation or your estimate is still going to be higher than it otherwise would have been if you didn't get hit over the head with that model data.
Yeah, you're right. So that information might get factored in, but you're always being pulled towards that initial value that you've been given. And in this case, like, it was a catastrophic value, so it was very hard to kind of disconnect from that one. It served as a very powerful anchor.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think that example you gave of the multiplication, so one plus, 1 times 2 times 2 on 7 times 6, like that's a great illustration of that, because you can crunch those numbers, but you're going to be you could be pulled in that one direction. Just like you can crunch the numbers of how many age stratified deaths and so on and so forth, but because you got hit with maybe that, it seems funny, like you got hit with that 7 at first, you got hit with the Imperial College at first. Now your estimate's going to be, and there's much more uncertainty in the pandemic situation in terms of numbers coming out, different sources, things are changing over time. Things always seem like they're compounding over time. You don't know. And interventions were happening. So things were being done. So it's like, okay, maybe it still will be that bad if, we hadn't done these things, or these things hadn't happened yet, or it's coming still. It's looming. So there's that uncertainty there as well, which would, I think, maybe increase the efficacy of that anchor, because it's going to operate on other channels as well.
Mm-hmm. So what are some other heuristics that might apply to the pandemic specifically, or maybe apply the ones you mentioned before to the pandemic, Jeff?
Like the ones I think some of the Gigerenzer, I'm not saying that his heuristics, but the ones
he mentions,
the ones Gigerenzer mentions, the imitate. What was it? I don't want to get it wrong here. Was it imitate
the majority?
Imitate the majority. Imitate the majority could be one where early on, even throughout, you're looking around, you're saying, what is everybody else doing?
Yeah.
Let's make that decision. I think that may have been one that was used. I think you could see that one maybe being used by policymakers, politicians as well. Thinking back, because you'd have these countries, these communities, these provinces, these states, and they didn't all sort of switch on at the same time. There was kind of this cascading, and people were kind of looking to see who did something first. And as more people, as more regions, more areas seemed to do stuff, that made it easier for other people to do stuff. So imitating what other countries, regions, provinces, states are doing. So it couldn't, maybe not just on the individual day-to-day decisions, but even on the broader policy decisions, you could have seen some of that effect happening for sure. Imitate the successful would be related to that too. Interesting to consider what would be considered, success under this context. It could have been something along the lines of, like if we think about the macro sort of regional decision policymakers, politicians, where they could be getting polling data in terms of what people want to see. And they're like, oh, this politician's going up in approval ratings in the polls because they implemented all these policies. I'm going to do that too. I don't want to be the one out in the cold, so I'm going to imitate what they did. What did they do? They had the lockdowns, they had the restrictions, they had the mandates, so so on and so forth. So I think those would be two definite heuristics that would likely have been used to do some of those policies or some of those behaviors, make those decisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What are some heuristics you think that maybe we could identify as being sort of new in the context of this pandemic? Like maybe we could speculate and make some observations and try to arrive at some heuristics that we saw playing out.
Right, some novel heuristics.
Yeah, some stuff that maybe we haven't read in the literature.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's one of the things with these heuristics, right? Is that they're sort of used and kind of created and applied to match certain situations and to result in maybe more or less successful decisions. I think one heuristic, this is what I was thinking of the other day, to make decisions. So this would be, I think, maybe applicable to across the wide range of the pandemic over the course of time would be, I don't have a good name for it, but it's something to the effect of nature is scary heuristic.
Right. Chaotic nature.
So the idea there being that you use that decision rule, nature is scary. So anything that's coming from nature is going to be worse than something that's coming from that's human made.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
So if you have that position and it's okay, the virus, if it's coming from not the lab, but it's coming from the bat, that's much scarier. That's much more serious. And what we need in response to the scary nature is we need some man-made interventions. So the vaccine, for example, is going to be preferred. Vaccine immunity is going to be preferred to natural immunity because nature's scarier than stuff that comes from people. And
scarier and maybe less perfect, right?
Scarier, more harmful. Yeah.
If we create something, we can create it to be better. Like it's going to be, we can tailor. Nature is kind of slow and clunky and kludgy and scary.
And it's out to get everybody. It's out to kill everybody all the time.
Or it just doesn't care about people. The people at the pharmaceutical company, they care about people, but not nature.
Tinker and select and be very precise. And then the natural state of people and interactions, that's not healthy. That's dangerous. Like all this like contact and all this socializing and all this human to human stuff, that's bad. So we need technological barriers and interventions to prevent we need more. Artificiality is good. Natural stuff is bad heuristic. And then you could apply that to, if you take that frame, or you take that lens, that decision rule, you have to choose between one or the other. You always pick the artificial. You go with the Zoom. You go with the Zoom. You don't go with the real interaction. You go with the vaccine. You don't go with the natural immunity. So on and so forth. What do you got?
Okay. So let's see. Maybe I've got one that's maybe related to the one that you have, but not quite. I'm going to call it the novelty heuristic. And the basic idea is that because you're faced with a new virus, a novel,
yeah,
a novel coronavirus, right?
You're fitting the heuristic to this situation. It's perfect.
Yeah, you require a novel, at least to the public, intervention. Okay, you have to have unprecedented solutions for unprecedented problems.
Yeah,
and so
okay.
This might be why you have these you have to have the pharmaceutical interventions, and you have to have all these other like huge interventions, like shutting down society. That's
it's
monstrous.
Never been done. It's never been done.
Never been done in our
perfect
recollected history, right? And so so you need to do that because it's because this is a novel bad situation. You need like an extreme novel intervention to deal with it. And
it's like a novelty matching or like extremity matching. I like that.
And I think, as you mentioned before at one point when we were talking about these sorts of things, that maybe that's why the hand washing kind of went by the wayside in the end, right? Because you didn't hear much about the hand washing.
What
that's because
to washing your hands?
I know. And specifically actually because of that Cochrane review, the Cochrane meta-analysis looking at these different interventions using randomized control trials or a meta-analysis of randomized control trials really showed that masking in the community masking mandates in the community didn't do very much, but hand washing actually was still doing something, especially for the children, right? For younger people washing their hands, it's quite effective, but that somehow went by the wayside.
So all the other interventions, big publicity, a lot of buy-in. Hand washing fell away. Hand washing is not novel. Right. There's nothing. Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
That's a good sign. Yeah. Yeah. Everything else, it's new. It's different.
Yeah.
Hand washing,
And
it's bland. Everybody knows about hand washing.
Yeah. And you need a new pharmaceutical. So there's no
I was
real
thinking
focus.
that,
Yeah. There's
not
no focus
not
on,
a traditional one. You can't use a traditional.
No, it's got to be new.
It's got to be new.
And so there was really no focus on repurposing old drugs and available drugs, right? Those were really poo-pooed. Like,
no,
those are for other things, right? Never mind about off-label use and the fact that there are many antivirals that we know of that are out there. You had to have this new key drug for the new bad virus.
Yeah. It had to be from a known class of interventions, but it has to be a whole new spin on that.
Yeah, that's right. It's got to be the new thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have another one that I was thinking about as well, and I would call this one maybe generalizing from extremes. Generalizing from extremes. Okay, and the basic idea is that principles that apply to an extreme situation also apply, though to a slightly lesser extent, to less extreme cases. Okay, so I'll give you an example of what I mean if that wasn't clear enough. So we would imagine that if you have a respiratory virus, that if you kind of completely covered your mouth and nose, let's say you put a bag over your head, like a plastic bag that's like very thick plastic, and you duct taped it all around, right? Then you would expect that there should be you don't want to do that for very long, by the way. So we're not recommending this. This is not a medical recommendation. But you would imagine that should completely stop the particles and the virus from being transmitted, right?
Yeah.
So you should not get sick, and you should not get other people sick.
That will work.
Yeah, it's like 100% block, right?
Yeah.
But I think then there's this implied assumption that as that barrier becomes a little bit less complete,
take some of the tape off.
Take some of the tape off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Add some pores into little pinholes into the thing,
so you don't die.
So that that there might be a linear, like some sort of a linear decrease in its effectiveness, right? So that the more porosity you introduce, there's going to be some sort of linear function. So it's okay if you have some pores because you're no longer 100% effective, but now you're, let's say, 80% effective, or maybe like 50% effective. And that led to the whole kind of layering of these interventions, right? Because you get 50% from that, you get, and so on. But, I was thinking of that post by Alyssa Milano where she is, advocating for the mask, and she herself is wearing a knitted mask.
Crocheted. It was crocheted.
It was crocheted,
which I think is more. I think it's more porous than knitting.
Yeah, because the idea is as long as you have something there, it's better. It's like
it's catching something. It's doing something.
Yeah, because it's on that function, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, she replied after she was made fun of. She replied, said, "No, I have these carbon filters like behind it, so maybe she had a more."
But that's just like, okay, so I'm going to move up the linear function a bit because there might be another layer in there.
Yeah, because what she showed was just like this kind of a strip thing in her tweet, which wouldn't cover like all around, right? So really, you're just kind of blocking just a little bit, but then it's coming out all the sides and stuff, right? But I think. There's a problem with that. That heuristic might actually apply in many cases, right? That you may have, like, as soon as you go away from the extreme, you may have some sort of a linear function type decline,
or maybe it's
effectiveness.
non-linear. But there could be
maybe it's non-linear, but it's kind of graded. But there's also the possibility that's, I think, ignored in this heuristic, or when this heuristic doesn't apply, is when you have you deviate slightly from the extreme, and then you have a catastrophic reduction in effectiveness. Mm-hmm. Right? Which would be the case if you have a virus that's so small that really, if you put on a cloth mask or something like this, it's just going right through. Yeah. But the assumption is, no, I'm still getting some effectiveness because I'm blocking something, right?
Yeah, something may catch one of those fibers and bounce back.
Or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's like, that reminds me of like a lot of this, I think a lot of the rhetoric around like almost like a capitulation of this, where it's like, we're not going to stop it, but we got to slow it.
Yes,
so it's
exactly.
This interplay between we're not stopping, we're slowing. And so whatever you would do to stop, if you just do not the extreme version of that, it's going to slow it down.
Very
the stopping,
good point.
The slowing, the flattening. the
Yeah,
alleviating.
because it's not 100% effective. It's
Yeah.
like it's maybe 50%, 80%. But and I think that's very logical to me to some extent. Except it sort of like it neglects the possibility that function drops off much more catastrophically, right? And then unless you're doing like the whole thing, the extreme intervention, like we're all locked up in our house, nobody's going anywhere, and you've got like little tiny machines like dropping off food for us and stuff.
Yeah, you can imagine a scenario. You can conjure a scenario.
You can conjure a scenario where it would all work, right? And theoretically, it should actually stop the spread of the virus at that point, and then it might even die off, right? Except for the fact that it's infecting animals, and so it's still going to be out in the environment. As soon as we come out, it's going to get us. But anyways, let's just leave that part aside because we're trying to do. The other heuristic might be something is better than nothing heuristic.
The do something heuristic. Yeah.
The do something. Yeah. That's right. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's not that effective. At least we're doing something. You got to do something.
It's got to have some, it could have some effect. Yeah.
Right. But back to the other one. Yeah. You can imagine these cases where you're like you've got the bag over your head and you're duct taped down, or you're in the spacesuit. Right. And that like makes total logical sense. And so you think to yourself, okay, like, well, if I put a pinhole in there, then it should be just as well. It should be just as good. But will it be? I don't know. Like we don't know the data on that.
Suit, if I kind of made my own version of the spacesuit with like a water container and some plastic wrap and stuff, and I could approximate that ideal, and that's going to do better than nothing.
Yeah. And then you have these lab studies. In fact, if we think about masking, you've got these lab studies that, where they're projecting stuff through a mask, like mannequins are breathing and they're trying to measure things and they're showing some functions and so on, right? But then like if you think about now extrapolating that to the real world where people are wearing masks that are like got holes on the sides and then they take them off to drink their water and stuff, like then I think that's why the Cochrane review is not showing much of an effect of masking or non-significant effect of masking in the community. It's because all these other factors come into play. So even if theoretically you had an effective barrier that should work, in practice, it's the effectiveness drops quite quickly, and then you have something that's very subpar.
Yeah, which brings it back to this like what is a heuristic? So you're intentionally cutting out having a very simple decision rule based on this understanding. You're cutting out all this other information, and maybe in this particular, in this situation, it's like it's not a useful heuristic. It's not effective because it's not ultimately by cutting out it. You're cutting out important information that should be informing the decision, and by relying on that simple rule, you're coming to a wrong conclusion because of the situation you're applying it to. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any other ones that you can think of, some novel heuristics, Jeff?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I thought of some that are on the other side. So on the more non-compliance side. So we've been talking about, what maybe some heuristics that would explain or that would get used to go along with a lot of the COVID policies. But on the other side of things, you have, people maybe using heuristics to make decisions for non-compliance. And I think, there's some very simple decision rules that could have been used for people making those decisions. One in particular I can think of is it'd almost be like it'd be like an anti-novelty. It'd be like an anti-novelty heuristic where there's like a reluctance to, or a refusal to incorporate any new behaviors or incorporate any new suggestions to policies or legal frameworks or morality or standards that wasn't in existence prior to 2019. So any new interpretation of, let's say, bodily autonomy or values or what's okay or what's not okay, the decision of like, okay, well, if we didn't all think this way in 2019, I'm not gonna go along with it. So I'm not gonna buy in to the novelty idea. In fact, I'm gonna go anti-novelty, and I'm gonna be I'm going to be the stick in the mud, and I'm going to stick to how things used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And if you applied
so
that no novelty rule, you would come down very clearly on a certain side of all policies and behaviors.
Yeah, including treatments, right? So if you're going to say any new treatment is a suspect treatment, then you're going to stay away from certain kinds of treatments.
Yeah. Let's see if I have another. I thought I had another one here.
Okay, while you look for that one, let me pop one out there. How about this one? The follow the signs heuristic.
Okay.
What do you think about that one? The follow the signs heuristic. So the basic idea is that science will give us the answers, and so we should just follow the scientific experts. And I think that that one, again, it's a very useful heuristic, right? Because I think in many cases that's very true. That science provides answers, and we can follow those answers. Mm-hmm. And that's fantastic. Now, it might have been misapplied in the context of the pandemic, because I think people assume that science can rapidly provide effective and decisive truths and understandings and solutions to newly emerging problems. I think people misapplied that heuristic in the case of COVID, because frankly, science sometimes can't work that fast, right? So you can't, for instance, say, oh, we've developed this new class of medication and it's completely safe, when you've only developed it like 2 months ago, in terms of like started to actually, test it in studies. You have no long-term safety profile. It's just impossible to do. Like, science cannot deliver a long-term safety profile when you don't give it enough time to actually test for that long-term safety profile, right? So I think this idea, follow the science, on the one hand, it's a great heuristic, but it can be misapplied. And it can also be misapplied if it could also be misapplied if you don't give certain scientists a voice in the debate. So if you suppress certain scientists, right? Like I'm thinking of the Twitter files where they're suppressing Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and other people from actually having a voice in the public square. Well, then you're following half the science, or you're following, 3/4 of the science, or whatever. Like you're not. One of the heuristics, right, is that if is a consensus type heuristic, right? That if there's consensus, then it must be accurate. But here we would be getting, not a complete consensus. It's like a fabricated illusion of consensus, and so that's when the follow the science heuristic might fall apart. And then I think the other place maybe that it might fall apart is if you try to apply a follow the science heuristic to problems that are fundamentally have to deal with values and ethics and morals, which science might not be able to speak to directly. It's more something that you have to assume and bring to the endeavor. So it's kind of like applying the follow the science to, incorrectly in an incorrect situation.
Right. Yeah. That's a good one. It kind of reminds me of that game that kids play, Simon Says. You know that game? Right. So Simon says, Dan, put your hands on your head. And then if you don't say Simon Says and you do the thing, you're out. But instead of Simon Says, it's Science Says.
That's right. And it was like science says, don't put your mask on. Science says, put your mask on.
Put your mask on, yeah.
Put 3 masks on.
Yeah, don't social distance. Oh, science didn't say don't social distance. You're out. Yeah. Science didn't say don't take the vaccine.
That's right.
You're out of work. Sorry. That's so that makes me think of, I want to go back to my heuristic where I was talking about this like anti-novelty heuristic. It just made me think with the default, this is the connection I just made. So with the default heuristic, it'd be like a default heuristic, but it's a default heuristic that's linked to time. So we're going by the 2019 default settings on society and behavior and on and on and on. And then with the novelty, it was like and you even have the phrase new normal. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to update the default settings. And they're even branding normal as novel. It's the new normal. So you're gonna love it. It's a perfect fit to everything, right? So it's an attempt to adjust the new default settings. So you're gonna go with the new default settings, or you're gonna go with the original default settings. And this even ties into some of the nudge stuff, where the nudgers talk a lot about the default settings and adjusting the defaults. And there's this conscious almost attempt to, reset the default settings of society and what was, normal under this new normal.
Yeah, new virus, you need a new normal.
You need a new normal, yeah. Here's one. Another one related to what you were saying about, you get this censorship of certain experts. So you get all this information, right? You're getting conveyed certain piece of information in mainstream legacy media, and then you got these other voices who are kind of pushed to the fringes, and you get this issue. You got to make a decision who you're going to listen to. Like, who do you got to decide, right? Can you listen to everybody? Mm-hmm. Maybe, but ultimately, where the rubber's going to hit the road, and you're going to have to they're going to be in disagreement, so you're going to have to make a decision one way or the other, who you're going to base your decision on. And I think one heuristic that could be quite useful for understanding how some people make decisions, I'm going to call it the paying the price heuristic. So when deciding who to listen to, you try and listen to the expert that's saying something and they're paying a price for saying it, but they continue to say it. So there's no rewards or incentives they're receiving, but somebody who's speaking in a way, raising issues, identifying, concerns, considerations, presenting data, so on and so forth, that are anti the majority. But not only is it just anti-majority, it's anti-majority, and there's a price being paid for being anti-majority. So paying attention to those dynamics because
they're not doing it out of their self-interest, because they're paying this heavy price for it. Yeah. So presumably, like, they're actually convinced that what they're saying is accurate, and the fact that they're paying a price means that the other position is threatened. Is concerned about that perspective, right? They don't want that voice to be shared. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, the other one maybe that dovetails to that we should mention maybe earlier is an appeal to authority. Yeah. That generally you trust the people that are in authority, especially in what we would consider like a democratic type system. And so if the so-called epistemic establishment shows a consensus, then you trust that consensus. And if they're all telling you, do this, the other thing, then you should just do it because they're probably right. They know something, the expert knows something that you don't know.
Right.
So just go with whatever they say.
And that reminds me of this article from, when was it? Was it 2020? It's kind of going back a little bit to the system 2. System 2. We haven't really talked about too much, but there's this article. It was in Forbes. I think it might be. I have a confession. I think it might be my favorite article.
Really? Ooh, okay.
I didn't know Forbes published satire.
Okay.
But it's called "You Must Not Do Your Own Research When It Comes to Science," and it's a great article. It's specifically discouraging. Did I say that right? Discouraging people from thinking for themselves, doing their own research, coming to their own decisions. So basically, don't do any system 2 processing. You're going to get yourself into trouble. The heuristic you want to use is do what the experts tell you. Do what the consensus is. Do what the experts tell you to do. So don't use system 2. Use system 1. And when you're using system 1, it's this heuristic you want to use. Here you go. And you're going to
That's so interesting because typically in the literature, in the reasoning, decision, judgment literature, they would say, what you want to do is encourage people to use system 2 because then they actually weigh up all the evidence. Yeah, but right. Like, you're seriously telling me that somebody was out there saying, like, seriously, they were saying, did they actually say don't do
it? Can I read some quotes?
Okay, I definitely need quotes. Like, I don't believe it was that strong.
All right, so this is right off the top. So research, this is where the article starts here. Research both sides and make up your own mind. That's in quotes. It's simple, straightforward, common sense advice. And when it comes to issues like vaccinations, climate change, and the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, It can be dangerous, destructive, and even deadly. So if you're doing system 2, you could be you're causing death and destruction.
Yeah, that's right.
Excuse me. Okay,
don't reason analytically. That's
you're gonna
it's
kill somebody.
Okay, but just okay. This was actually in Forbes.
This was in Forbes. Yeah. To be fair, it's a opinion piece. It's an editor's pick. It's called.
But it's editor's pick. But it's not really satire, right? Like this guy's writing.
No, it's not.
Like,
it's not. As far as I can tell, it's not. It could be. I don't know, but I'm not sure if one of these satirists got in there under a fake name or something like that. Okay, so it goes on. So even those of us who are scientists ourselves lack the relevant scientific expertise needed to adequately evaluate that research on our own. In our own fields, we're aware of the full suite of data and how those puzzle pieces fit together and what the frontiers of our knowledge is. When laypersons espouse opinions on those matters, it's immediately clear to us where the gaps in their understandings are and where they've misled themselves in their reasoning. When they take up the arguments of a contrarian scientist, we recognize that they're overlooking, misinterpreting, omitting. Unless we start valuing the actual expertise of legitimate experts, the expertise that legitimate experts have spent lifetimes developing, doing your own research could lead to immeasurable, unnecessary suffering. So, here's a good one. Here's another one. Okay, so there is no excuse. Okay, Dan, no excuse. With all the wonderful scientists and science communicators telling the truth about a whole slew of issues in our world, for people to seek out only the opinions that confirm their own biases. The best scientists in the world, even those who hold contrarian beliefs of their own, all agree that we should base our policies on the scientific consensus that we've achieved. So even those that don't agree. When that consensus changes, evolves, or moves forwards because we've learned more than we previously knew, we should correct our course, follow that novel path instead. So there's no excuse for not following the consensus. You definitely don't want to follow some path that's not part of the consensus. And everybody agrees.
That's
even
right.
the ones who hold contrarian opinions, even they agree you should follow the consensus.
Yeah. And the thing is that, you shouldn't actually try to understand the scientific literature or read the papers or listen to the dissenters, because that will hurt you. So don't do any work. And it will hurt others. I know that's the key thing. You don't care about yourself so much as you don't want to hurt others. Totally true. And so that's why you have to use these. Okay, so these very simple heuristics of just follow the science, listen to the experts, and this kind of thing, right? Which is why I think it's madly frustrating for some people when they discover that they were actually suppressing a whole lot of experts, and that what was being brought before them as a consensus was not like the consensus of the whole scientific community and all the relevant experts, but a subset of those experts. But you actually bring up another interesting topic here, which is what might have led to a reliance on heuristics during the COVID-19 pandemic, because the whole theory here, we look at the dual process theory, is that during the pandemic, people were doing a lot of system 1 heuristic based thinking. And then is there something about the COVID pandemic that predisposed people to use that kind of thinking? And I think you've identified one feature. You were told. You were
specifically given instructions. Yeah.
You were told to use system 1 and not system 2 in this article, in this case. Yeah. Okay. But what are some others? Like one, sorry, go on.
Not only that, you're told by experts to use the.
That's right. Yeah. And of course you got to trust the experts.
Trust the experts because they're the one. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm thinking of another one that might be quite important, and that is fear. Fear might actually have led us to do some biased reasoning. And there's a very useful summary on research relating fear and the dual process models in an article that was published in Psychology Today. It's titled, "How Does Fear Influence Risk Assessment and Decision Making?" And I think it was actually published in 2020 or 2021. I would have to find that one again. But in any case, So there's evidence that fear leads us to overestimate the risk of a feared event and to overestimate the effectiveness of mitigation strategies, which I think fits very perfectly with COVID beliefs, right? People initially overestimated the risk, and we saw those models and so on, and that led to these major interventions like lockdowns, and then people initially overestimated the effectiveness of these lockdowns. They thought, oh, we just do this, everything will be fine. It turned out it wasn't fine. It just kept going and going, regardless of all these different layers of interventions that they put into place, right? Now, apparently there's a caveat. I looked into the literature, and there's some evidence showing that some people in certain situations, when they're afraid, will actually hold off on using heuristics, and they'll want to seek more evidence, seek more data. But I think during the pandemic, and this might be another key factor that led to the heuristics, especially early on, the evidence was very poor. There was a paucity of reliable scientific evidence and access to that evidence. But I think there are some people who actually, the fear actually led them to start to dig into the data more. Yeah. And they started following the early papers, let's say, coming out of various countries who were dealing with this, early on. Like I'm thinking of some of the papers coming out of Israel, who, especially in terms of the mitigation strategies, were ahead of us on the whole implementation curve. And so you can learn a lot from that data, and those people might have made different decisions because that data wasn't really meshing with exactly what we were being told was going on, or how, with regard to how effective some of these mitigation strategies actually were.
I came across some research that showed that negative mood made people more likely to use anchoring in particular.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's mood, not fear. But negative being sad, I think was maybe one of the, so kind of lower arousal negativity. You're going to be more likely to rely on anchoring.
Which was certainly going on in the pandemic. I think there's lots of research showing that people's mood went down, even though maybe they weren't fully afraid with the high level arousal negative affect. They might have had low level arousal negative affect, which would be
absolutely
that kind of thing. Yeah,
this kind of reminds me too of if we go, when we talked about that article a while back, the Van Bavel and colleagues et al. There's a paragraph or two in there specifically about the negativity, like negative emotion and information processing that you remind me of when you're talking. I'll read from it here. I just pulled it up. So negative framing captures attention, especially people who are less mathematically skilled. The media usually report on COVID negatively, for example, by reporting the number of people infected and those who die as opposed to those who recover or experience only mild symptoms. This may increase negative emotion and sensitize people to otherwise neglected risks for themselves and others. So increasing that negativity is going to make people more attuned to negative things. So there's this like matching of like a congruence between feelings and the information you seek. So you feel negative, you're going to seek out the negative information, pay attention to the risks more so than if you're, it's fine, I feel more optimistic.
Yeah, that makes total sense, Jeff. And I was just thinking of another key factor that might have led people to be more likely to use heuristics during the pandemic and rely on their biases. And that's time pressure. And then maybe we can also include cognitive load. Okay, time pressure and cognitive load. And because, as you pointed out earlier on, that analytic thinking requires time and it requires limited cognitive resources, whereas heuristical processing does not require these, right? So both time pressure and cognitive load would reduce your ability to use the analytic system and drive you towards using the heuristic type system. And you can remember the beginning of the whole COVID pandemic. I'll tell you how I experienced it. We saw some pictures and some things on the news from China, and then all of a sudden they were shutting down in-person teaching at the university. And so I was near the end of the semester, but I had to switch to teaching online. So there was all this change going on. And I had a lot more of a workload all of a sudden because I had to adjust to doing everything online, and there was all sorts of decisions to be made with the school and the kids and so
closing,
on. Yeah. So that creates a huge cognitive load, and with regard to maybe planning for the future and so on, and you just don't have the time or the cognitive bandwidth to be able to think through carefully some of these things. And so you're much more likely than just to go with the basic heuristics. You look around, what are other people doing? Okay, I guess we'll do that.
What
and what are they recommending?
What is the science saying? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. What's the expert say? Okay, we'll just do that. And so on. So I think that there were these factors at play during the pandemic, and I think they are at play generally during crises that push us away from analytic processing and to these more heuristic system one type processing. And maybe that could explain why people might have engaged in more system one processing, and maybe they didn't even recognize it. And they're still feeling like they are reasoning through things and making decisions. And oh my goodness, there's so many to make. And of course, I'm weighing it up. But what are you weighing up? You're weighing up, the message that you heard from, your politician about or your medical expert or something like this telling you what to do. And so you feel like you're reasoning, but really you're using these heuristics. And those are driving your behavior. And if you think about it, maybe we can explain a lot of behavior that people engage in, or a lot of the reasoning processes that led to the behavior they engage in, maybe on multiple sides of the debate, by just thinking about the biases and heuristics that were primed or that they were pushed towards because of the nature of the crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's an interesting kind of bait and switch that happens too, where some of the heuristics, let's say like the follow the science branded heuristics, they got a wrap or a veneer of being rational. That's like that is so analytical.
Like follow the science.
Follow the science is analytical, so I'm doing that. So I'm analytical, but even though I'm using a heuristic.
Yeah, even though you're not doing any real analysis, you're just doing whatever the expert tells you. That's a brilliant point.
Wrapped in analytical with an analytical veneer.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point.
I think so. I'm going to do a podcast. This is like a podcast extrapolation here. I think you could see some of that. There could have been some of this kind of in the rhetoric where like when Fauci said that famous thing where it's like he's science.
Yeah.
So this is podcast theory. So you apply that framework. If he's science, if I do whatever he says, I'm following science. So whatever he says is then by default analytical, because science is going to be analytical. So you can stack these. You could stack these heuristics by like I'm gonna swap out. It's still ultimately the same thing. Don't pay no attention to what's going on over here. I'm gonna do the sleight of hand. But now, don't worry. I'm still being very analytical, even though I'm following what this guy is saying, because and you can kind of chain it. You can chain it together. How about that for a podcast? That's
this is actually a brilliant idea, Jeff, that you feel like you're analytical because you're heuristically following.
It's branded as an analytical heuristic.
Yeah, that's right. You're following, let's say, science, which is analytical, or you're following this person who is branded as being the analytical person who has access to all the information and so on. It's kind of funny because the whole alternative approach, of course, that contradicts exactly what the Forbes guy is saying is give people information. Just allow people to access all the trial
but you
data.
Can't. That's dangerous.
I know.
Because then they're going to look at it.
They're going to look at it. That's right. We know that democracy ultimately is putting things into people's hands. Ultimately leads them to hurt themselves. So we got to take it out of their hands, and
it's crazy, right?
Yeah. I don't know. So Jeff, one of the things that you mentioned also is this class of reasoning. Do you want to get into that? The abductive reasoning.
Okay, so I've been looking through. I bought it on Amazon. I bought the Thought Crime Legal Code. You can buy it on Amazon. It tells you all about the legal code for thought crimes. And there's a subsection. I'm trying to say this with a straight face. There's a subsection for thought crimes. It's section 3 on page 33, line 3.
See, initially I thought you were being serious.
I
Because
was selling it pretty good, right?
because like these days I imagine that could be true.
It could be a thing.
I don't know.
Things are so absurd. Like, yeah.
Okay.
All right. So there's a thought crime, and it's called abductive reasoning.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is
Abductive reasoning.
Abductive reasoning. Yeah.
Okay.
So most people are familiar with inductive and deductive reasoning. You get maybe acquainted with it in your education, in your school. You get told all about it. So deductive reasoning is probably like the more like classic, where you start with premises and then you reason from those premises to come up with specific inferences or conclusions, right?
Yeah, and in deductive reasoning, if your premises are true, then your conclusion is most certainly true.
Right. But you could also reason from a false premise and then have a logically coherent conclusion that this happens.
Yeah, you can have a valid conclusion, but the concluding claim is not actually true. Yeah.
Okay. Then there's inductive, which is basically the inverse of that. So this is kind of like a content neutral example of both inductive and deductive. So with the deductive, here we go. All the beans from this bag are white. These beans are from this bag. Therefore, these beans are white. So it's going from the specific premise, reasoning to a conclusion. And then induction is basically the opposite of that, or an inversion of that. And here's an example. These beans are from this bag. These beans are white. All the beans from this bag are white. So with this example, we can kind of see a bit of a asymmetry in terms of like what type of reasoning would be maybe stronger. That you could kind of see weaknesses, in the inductive reasoning, where it's like, okay, maybe that's not going to actually be true, but based on what you can have some uncertainty there, but you're gonna come to some kind of inference based on that sequence, right? So most people are familiar with those types of reasoning. What's really interesting is there's a third type of reasoning that's not necessarily as popular. Many people aren't necessarily familiar with. That's the abductive reasoning I told you about. And here's without trying to describe it first, here's how it would look. So the surprising fact C is observed, but if A were true, C would be a matter of course. Hence, there is reason to suspect that A is true. So this type of reasoning was sort of more formalized and introduced by Charles Peirce. And it's completely logical. In other words, it's allowed, it's real, it exists. It's not fake, it's not made up. It's formally logical. And what you're doing with this type of reasoning is you're going from observation to a hypothesis or to a theory, and you're doing so within a logical system. So this is what I was talking about with respect to the thought crimes, because there's effectively two charges that can get levied against you if you use abductive reasoning, or if maybe attempted to use abductive reasoning over the past 3 years. The first one is the surprising facts that get observed. So if you notice some surprising facts, there might be some penalty you would pay for that. But in addition to noticing surprising facts, what you do with those surprising facts with respect to how you reason from that surprising fact to a hypothesis or a theory, that would be the second opportunity for maybe some penalties with respect to thought crimes. So
because they are conspiracy theories at that point.
You can think about this maybe as conspiratorial, right? Like you're developing these ideas, and these ideas there's nothing in the environment that would specifically point to those ideas, but you're piecing things together in a logical way that is suggestive of something happening. And that's forbidden, right? You can't do that. So what I think was more heavily the type of reasoning that was more favored was inductive and deductive reasoning, specific types of inductive and deductive reasoning. So specifically, I think deductive reasoning was maybe the home base for a lot of this stuff, where the rules, the premises were specified. So there were certain things that were truisms, and then you go from those, and then you reason your way from those. So just a couple of examples here. Let's see here. So for one, start with the premise, all vaccines. So vaccines are safe and rigorously tested. That's a matter of course. It's been that way throughout history. That's a truism. We agree with that. We start with that premise. The COVID-19 vaccines, the COVID-19 jabs are vaccines. Therefore, the COVID-19 jabs are safe and rigorously tested.
That's a deductive reasoning.
Deductive reasoning, yeah. You start with the premise that vaccines are safe and rigorously tested. This is a vaccine, therefore this is also safe and rigorously tested. Now, the extent to which that premise is not true, now you have, some issues around the accuracy or validity or the legitimacy of the conclusion. But within that system, if that premise is true, you're completely justified in, making those conclusions.
What's interesting there, by the way, Jeff, is that conclusion, like you may actually feel like you're being very analytic and you're arriving at a correct conclusion because it would be a valid conclusion.
Would be correct.
Like the conclusion follows from the premises. But of course, if the premises are not fully accurate, then your conclusion could be false, right? And if, for example, in this case, like if the vaccine wasn't given the time to be fully tested and so on because of the emergency, then that would be a premise that was kind of left out. And so that would make the conclusion not to be true.
Exactly.
Not to be accurate. But you would still feel like you're being very reasonable and you're making a rational decision.
You're being logical, you're being rational. Yep. You're being completely coherent and consistent within that system. Mm-hmm. So the example of inductive, which is a little, I think, trickier. Here's one where you're going to go from the observations or the specifics to the general. So I've followed all the COVID protocols to this point. I haven't gotten COVID-19. Therefore, if I continue to follow the protocols, I will never get it. Another one is I've taken all the boosters. I haven't died from COVID-19. Therefore, if I continue to take all the boosters, I won't die of COVID-19. And so on. So you can see those types of inductions or inductive reasoning, that would be, generally accepted, and most people probably agree with those conclusions. So if we contrast that with the abductive reasoning, it's quite different. Where you notice something that's unique and surprising, and then you piece in conditions or considerations that would coincide with that thing being true, and the extent to which you have some reason to believe that's the case, now you have a hypothesis or you have a theory of something being true. Now, it's not as tight. It's not as tight as the deductive, and it's different from inductive, although it's similar.
Right. So the key feature of this abductive reasoning, and maybe what makes it different from inductive reasoning, is that you're actually trying to create an explanatory mechanism. You're trying to create a hypothesis or an explanation of certain events, whereas induction is just about inferring something from prior observations. Yeah,
inferring to a general principle or what have you. And one of the things that's interesting about this system that was proposed by Peirce is it's quite useful in novel environments. So it can be useful in generating novel discoveries. And as we've talked about in this podcast so far, there's a lot of novelty happening with COVID-19, where a lot of stuff's happening, a lot of sense making is trying to occur. But at the same time, you basically get the stifling of this type of reasoning, of this type of logic. And one of the things I think is quite interesting about this type of reasoning is, I think if you go down the list of sort of celebrity COVID dissidents, I think you could probably identify in each and every one of those individuals, their origin story is going to be some application of abductive reasoning that got them to where they are. Mm-hmm. A couple that come to mind, for example, there's one individual out there, Ed Dowd. he's probably, I think I would give him probably the certificate for outstanding achievement in the field of abductive reasoning, because he's kind of an abductive reasoning machine. The way he lays things out and the way he thinks. He doesn't call it abductive reasoning. He calls things like investment theses. He's a financial guy. But he's basically has a series of conclusions that he's arrived at through abductive reasoning. So, for example, I think one of, I don't want to butcher it too much, but one of the things that I've heard him mention is he talks about the clinical trials, and he talks about the deaths and the conditions, and how there was the all cause mortality in the experimental condition was higher than the control condition. So he noticed that surprising fact. He's like, that's really odd. That's really surprising that more people died in the experimental condition than the control condition. That's surprising. Then they coincide with that. He found out that I think it was Pfizer. They were trying to withhold certain data for X number of years, or something like 80 years or 75 years or something like that.
Yeah, 70 something. Yep.
Yeah. So he said, okay, so this mortality endpoint was missed. They're trying to hide the data. Therefore, because I observed C, so those two things, if somebody's up to something, if somebody's engaging in nefarious activities, those things would be true. Therefore, I have reason to suspect that these companies aren't acting in good faith and something's going on. And it's basically an abductive reasoning exercise. There's no guarantee. It's a speculation. It's a hypothesis. It's a thesis.
It's a conspiracy theory.
It's a conspiracy theory. But you get there using this abductive process. Another example is Steve Kirsch. He's a pretty, I think he's like the most popular spreader of misinformation or something like that. He's branded himself, or he's been branded as a super spreader of misinformation or something to that effect. And he, in his origin story, I think he talks about how in his personal life, he was observing vaccine injuries. So people he knew, they had adverse events that were caused by the vaccine. So he observes this surprising fact. I'm noticing injuries in my immediate circle. If the vaccines weren't as safe as I'm being told they are, I would expect to see these injuries. Therefore, I have reason to believe they're not as safe as I'm being told they are. Or an inverse would be, if they're as safe as I'm being told they are, I shouldn't be seeing these injuries in the rates I'm seeing them personally. Therefore, I have reason to suspect that something's going on. And then from that, X, Y, and Z happens, and here we are today. So on and on and on. I think you can go through basically most dissidents probably have some origin story that relates to noticing something that's weird, piecing together, well, if that's true, then this would also happen. Therefore, I think something's going on with this other thing. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, that makes total sense.
An interesting case close to home is Daniel Bulford, he was in the RCMP, because one of the when you with this abductive reasoning, one of the ways it gets sort of explained, or example that gets used, is basically criminal investigations or court cases where you're trying to piece this information together, and abductive reasoning gets used in these criminal investigations. And years ago, when Daniel Bulford came out against all the COVID mandates, he applied, if I'm remembering correctly, he basically applied this like investigative framework on it to say, like, here's why this doesn't add up to me. This why it doesn't make sense. Here's why I don't agree with it. And it's effectively like an abductive reasoning process, where it's like a discovery investigative process where you're piecing together these facts. If you piece together these facts in a certain way, it would suggest or point to this being true or that being true. Or maybe there's a stronger likelihood of this being true than this other thing being true, but it formulates this thesis, hypothesis that leads you to maybe investigate further, which ultimately is supposed to result in, if it's true or if it's correct or there's some accuracy to what you're saying, is that thing that surprised you at first, now you're not going to be as surprised anymore because you're going to expect it. You're going to see what's happening. So if your theory is true, if your hypothesis is true, you reduce surprises. And I think a lot of people in certain circles can probably attest to the fact that they probably abduced, I don't know if that's a real word, I might have just made it up. They abduced a theory or hypothesis, and then they use that theory or hypothesis to predict. And maybe some of those predictions actually made sense and are much better able to make sense of the world in the future by applying the theory and hypotheses they derived at through abduction, which would then feed back into and support maybe the accuracy or the correctness of their hypotheses that they came to as a result of this abductive reasoning process.
I'm thinking of another example here, and that might be the origins of COVID. Is that reasoned through an abduction process? Because what you have is just a bunch of pieces of information, and then you're trying to now sort of come up with an explanation. So if it's a natural, so if you would expect it to be from nature, there might be certain things you would expect, and the question is, do you observe those?
Right? Do you see those?
And if you expect it to be from the lab, you would. If you go back to the Nature Origin paper that was published, one of the things that they mention in there, and we know from the emails now that they were some of those co-authors were actually initially leaning towards a lab leak kind of a theory, but then they all kind of got on the same page of a natural origins theory in the 11th hour before publication. But one of the things that always was curious was the polybasic furin cleavage site and the nature of that site on the spike protein, because you don't see those in other coronaviruses. So even in the Nature Origins paper, they kind of mention it. For me, that was a real red flag, because they mention it and they say, well,
right.
This is a curious thing, but it just must be that we haven't yet discovered coronaviruses that actually have that
right.
in it, right? But
yeah, pay no attention to that surprise. Just let that surprise.
Yeah, don't pay attention to that. And other people pointed out, but the exact base pairs that are being used in that polybasic cleavage site match the way you would insert that in a laboratory context if you were actually messing around with it. And so that then lends evidence in your abductive thinking that it might be a lab leak
right.
kind of scenario. And of course, now people have actually accepted the possibility, at least. Now you're allowed to consider the possibility. Are we allowed to consider the possibility that it might have been a lab leak?
Permission to consider the possibility,
yeah. I don't know. What are we allowed to say? What are we allowed to say? I don't know. Right. So what you're saying here, just generally, is that there is a type of rational logic. Like you're actually using the analytic system, but it doesn't have the feel of a deduction, of a logical deduction, yet nevertheless, it is a very valid way of reasoning. You're using a system too. It gets used in
science all the time, epistemology. It's totally permissible.
Right.
It's totally permissible.
That's right.
You're allowed to do abductive reasoning.
So we don't want to mistake abductive reasoning for heuristics and biases,
right?
Because abductive reasoning is a system 2 type thing. Yet it's maybe precisely the thing that we were discouraged from doing in this context, because you don't have enough expertise to be able to piece all that information together in a reasonable way. You don't have access to all the information, so don't do that kind of thinking.
Right. Here's the thing: you may actually be able to think of it as a combination of the two systems.
Okay.
Namely, so you use your system 2 to maybe do the formulations, to do you pay attention, you notice, you piece things together. But ultimately the hypotheses or the theory you derive, what are you using to derive that theory? You could be using a system 1 process. You can be drawing from this pool of knowledge and information that would be maybe heuristical, right? To arrive at different theories and different hypotheses, because there's an infinite number of theories and hypotheses somebody could come up with. So so this isn't going to say that all abductive reasoning, is created equal. There could be reasons and explanations that are going to be more plausible than others.
Right. And you're going to use your intuition partly to be able to disentangle that to some extent. So let me then just restate it, that maybe what you're saying is that you are actually using system 1 at times to engage in abductive reasoning. So like what you're saying is, let me make sure I got it right, you're using kind of both systems in that kind of a logical system.
I'm sort of just speculating, but if we were to try and integrate the two,
got it.
I could see both systems being implicated in this style of reasoning, particularly because then you can get into situations where it doesn't have to be one and done. It could be iterative, right? So you notice the thing, you hypothesize, and then you could analyze. You can employ analytic thinking to further investigate and assess the quality of hypotheses and theses that you derive at from those inferences. Does that make sense?
Yep. You remind me actually of a philosophy of science book by Polanyi, who was, I think he was like a really well-known scientist who ended up becoming a philosopher of science. And the book is called Personal Knowledge. And the argument that he makes is that sometimes scientific inquiry is driven by intuition and sort of sometimes like an inarticulate personal knowledge, like a feeling, and you pursue certain hypotheses because of that. And because, as you mentioned, the scientific reasoning process does include this kind of abductive thinking. Maybe that's what he's talking about, right? That you actually are using intuition to guide you through alternatives and so on. So even though you're both using very, very analytical processes, but also your intuition as a scientist, and the abductive process is where those two might come together in a very interesting, creative way.
Yeah. Another feature I want to mention about this abductive reasoning is it's got this thing where it says it violates the monotonicity. If I said that right. Monotonicity. Where
sounds good to me.
It's close enough, right? Where you could basically have a set of premises, let's say, and you can come to your theory for what's your best explanation based on all those things. But then something can come along, just one piece of information can come along, and that could alter the accuracy or the likelihood of that first conclusion actually being true, or first inference actually being true. Does that make sense? So I think you can maybe apply this. This is, once again, we're going into the podcast theory domain, where I think you could apply this, because you hear some people talk about. You ever heard people talk about the red pill? Like, when did you get red pilled? Like your red pill moment. Mm-hmm. I think you could potentially apply this abductive reasoning to that situation where a piece of information comes along that changes somebody's whole framework and whole lens on things. So you had an understanding, you had a theory, a hypothesis on how things work, but then one piece of information comes along and blows it all up.
Actually, one example of this might be, and we mentioned them in the previous podcast, is Malhotra.
I have him down here. You want to mention him?
Sure. Yeah, because he was a promoter of, let's say, the vaccine solution and so on, until that one piece of data came, which was that his father, all of a sudden, very healthy, takes the vaccine, heart problem, dies.
Yep.
And so that's the piece of information that then led him to go back and re-examine some of the other information and assumptions that he'd made. And that led to a full-on reconfiguration of his view and his conclusion and his sort of his way of thinking about the whole problem.
Another one I could think of is Mike Yeadon. He was a former pharmaceutical executive. There's one thing in particular I saw him say where he was making reference specifically to the vaccine manufacturers and the spike protein. And he had the abduction that he noticed the curious fact that every manufacturer focused on the same part of the virus, namely the spike. And he said from his experience, he's like, that's kind of weird. That's kind of strange, because if you're developing some kind of new pharmaceutical, you would try and be original or unique or separate yourself from the competition. But the surprising fact that everybody is doing the same thing and they should be in competition with one another, that makes him suspect that there's something else going on with respect to behind the scenes collaboration and so on. So that would be an abductive reasoning, right?
Yeah. And the thing is that obviously, like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion that one draws from that is accurate, right? So for example, in that regard, you might imagine, well, the reason why everybody went for that one is because it's the biggest protein that's sticking out of that thing, right? So everybody it's like you have the thing and it's like, here it is. So everybody says, let's address that big protein.
Yeah. There could be.
But what I found more striking
theories. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's right. So you could have all sorts of different kinds of theories, And so probably a good idea to hold these theories loosely, right? To be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then see how, as more data is added, right, you kind of keep adjusting your theory, which is what a scientist does, really. That's scientific thinking to some extent, right?
Yeah.
I think as a scientist, you always want to hold all your hypotheses and even your conclusions loosely, and always be ready for disconfirming evidence so that you can adjust your perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another application that gets talked about with abductive reasoning is medical diagnoses. So how do you get to a diagnosis? So you make these observations, you try and infer some kind of maybe common underlying cause. And one of the things that's interesting in the COVID situation is that diagnostic process, that abductive diagnostic process, basically got taken away and supplanted with the test, with the PCR test. So there's no abduction for diagnoses. It was, you got the test, it was positive. If it was positive, you had it. And if it was negative, you didn't have it. So not only was abduction forbidden in general thinking, you're not allowed to do that, you're not supposed to do that, it's off limits. Even in situations where it's generally accepted that's going to be happening, medical diagnoses, there was not even room for abduction there. So if somebody came in, so let's say, for example, blah, 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 presents certain evidence, but a positive COVID test came in, then that supersedes all other sources of information. And there's one and only one conclusion to make with respect to the diagnosis. So it takes all the mystery out of it.
And assumes a perfect test.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is interesting. So there's potentially this environment that was created where there was basically no room for abduction. There was this like abduction deficit, I think, in the world. And do you remember what came along in the pandemic? There was a certain game that came along during the pandemic that got really popular. There was a certain word game. There was like a word game that came along. I think it was called Wordle.
Okay.
Did you hear about that game?
No.
It was like all the rage there for a while. A bunch of, people were kind of obsessed with it. And what's fascinating about that is the game basically operates via abduction, as far as I can tell. You're trying to decipher, what's the word based on, certain circumstances. There's another game that gets used as an example. It's a game Mastermind, where you have to figure out what a color pattern is behind a closed thing. And you basically use abductive processes to try and generate the solution. So it created this interesting thing. I noticed this pattern where this word game came along that uses abduction. So if you're forbidden from using abduction, and then this game comes along, do you have like a need or an abduction itch that you need to scratch given the environment? And this game comes along and provides the opportunity to exercise those muscles. So you jump on it because you're just craving it.
So you do it in the context of the game where it's allowed,
where it's allowed. Yeah, you provide the outlet for the abduction.
Socially sanctioned outlet for the abduction process.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So there we have it. That is, thought crime, COVID thought crime, abduction.
Yeah. Not only that, but you mentioned a bunch of individuals in the whole COVID narrative space that have been relegated to the nether regions,
to the fringe.
More thought crimes, Jeff. You're just violating norms right now. You just thought crimes all over the place. I know we're bad. We're bad. But let's maybe we should close up here because we're going pretty long already. So the basic idea, I think, what we try to suggest here is that you can apply this dual process thinking to the pandemic. People probably using system 1 heuristics quite a bit, and maybe they were primed to use that. Maybe some of the nudges also activated some of those heuristics or piggybacked on top of some of those heuristics. And maybe people were using less system 2 at times, and maybe that got them into some reasoning problems. And then you also brought up this abduction, which might be a type of reasoning that was poo-pooed, but which makes use of these different systems in an interesting way. And it's a very valid way of thinking, even though it's been demoted by individuals. And so it's worthwhile thinking about that as well. Do you have any final thing to add here, Jeff, before we close off?
Yeah, so I just want to emphasize the point again. I mentioned it before, but I think one of the things that's particularly striking about abductive reasoning is just highlighting the point that it is allowed, that it is permissible, that it is, it is logical, and that it is not, it's not like a fringe or reckless or dangerous activity. And it's quite fitting to be used in a situation where there is uncertainty and there's a lot of novelty, and you're trying to get to the bottom of stuff, and you are trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah, I think in general, our recommendation would be exactly opposite of the Forbes article. And
that's why it's satire, Dan. Come on.
Yeah, we would say you actually do want to engage system 2 and even abductive reasoning and so on to try to make sense of things. Go and find the actual information. Wait, don't just knee-jerk respond following the crowd. Wait, think about it. Try to find the dissenting experts and just listen to them. You don't have to, go along with what they say. They could be wrong too, but at least it's important to listen to them. It's probably very important to remain skeptical. I would also say it's very important to look for contradictions and surprising, as you mentioned, Jeff, surprising data points along the way. Because they tell you that if you're surprised by something, maybe your theory isn't fully correct. Your abductive reasoning isn't fully correct. And I would also probably tell people to, since I'm kind of giving recommendations here off the top of my head, is to keep an eye out for shifting goalposts in terms of, I think we saw that a lot going on in the pandemic. So initially, for instance, the vaccines were going to stop the spread completely, and then that's why you have to mandate them to protect others, right? And then all of a sudden, people realize, oh, they don't really work that way, and then now it's like we're protecting the healthcare system, right? Because we're preventing severe illness with these vaccines. So that was a shift in goalpost. But if you're just preventing severe illness, then why are you mandating them now, right? So like there's all these kinds of moves going on, and so people should be attuned to these nuanced changes in positions.
I'll bring it together with that. I think what you just did there was you just demonstrated abductive reasoning.
Correct. Yeah.
So things are shifting. Why are things shifting? Things are shifting in a way. Now you're doing this thing. That doesn't make sense, does it? If things are so certain and stable, then that wouldn't have happened, right?
Yeah, things aren't adding up anymore. And then so now, okay, what does that say, right? And
Which reminds me, okay, I don't know if we have time to get to this, but there was a clip I wanted to play. I just remembered. I forgot. There's a video clip I wanted to play. Okay, so this is from Brett Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast, and it is Neil Oliver walking through how he came to realize something wasn't quite right with what he was experiencing and being told. So it's only a few minutes, so let's listen to this explanation.
It's the aggression, I think, that triggered me early on. It was how rapidly that which might reasonably have been advice became coercive instruction, backed up by real slanderous, aggressive, vitriolic, shaming rhetoric. And I thought, if the people who ought to have our best interests at heart in this, if they really are doing it for our good, they wouldn't need to force it. If it's consensual and it comes from a place of love, it's a different animal than this. I thought, why am I being shouted at already? I haven't done anything wrong. I asked some questions early on. My wife and I asked questions about vaccines. All we did at the beginning was say, let's watch this, because this is all new stuff. Let's just wait and see. But waiting and see was swiftly taken away as an option. It was like fish or cut bait now. And if you don't do the right thing, we're coming for you. And the rapidity of that, how quickly it was like that, was what triggered the lizard tail in my amygdala or something. And I thought, for the first time in my life, I'm in danger here from people, and I know not whom, but I know I'm in danger. And I wasn't quite sure what to do, fight or flight, but I knew I was, and it was the first time in my life my body had ever responded. It was a real physiological response to danger. At aged 53 or whatever age I was when all this started, and I thought, I've never felt like this before, and I just trusted it. I thought, well, I have to pay attention to that, because that's coming from somewhere deep. And I thought, this is not authentic. There's something profoundly wrong here. I don't know what it is, but because I've identified it physiologically, I have to pay attention.
There's his explanation, and I think you could see in his explanation, you could see the abductive reasoning in my view, where he's saying, so if this was the case, then why would that happen? And because this thing happened, it doesn't make sense given that other thing, then something else must be going on. And it's this like detection. He's operating, he's describing it as this, like, ultimately it evolved into like this threat detection. But it's like, well, why are you shouting at me? Why are you forcing me? If this was being done out of love, you wouldn't have to be forcing me. So therefore, this isn't probably not being done out of love. There's probably something else going on here. So you can see the abductive process. He articulates it quite well in terms of he's seeing these surprising things that contradict with other messaging. And then he's integrating that information to draw other conclusions. And ultimately, the conclusion or the theory, the hypothesis he's drawing, he comes to, is that there's some kind of threat happening here. There's something nefarious happening. I'm under threat. And then the attribution of that to this, like, amygdala, the lizard tail he describes, is interesting. But ultimately, I think what he's talking about is there's this awareness of a threat that gets arrived at via this process of abduction, and then that triggers potentially the emotional fear response or threat detection. What are your thoughts? Yeah,
which would be the more sort of automatic type of a response. So there you see the combination, actually, as you've been saying, the kind of the logical deduction and piecing things together, and then part of that maybe eliciting, but maybe part of it also being that the visceral response, the emotional automatic response, which becomes a data point. I think in his argument, it becomes a data point itself. Hey, this is how here's how I'm feeling about it. That's another data point, but it's also maybe guiding him a little bit to say that this is not as it seems. All is not as it seems here. There must be something else going on. Yeah. No, so it's a fascinating example.
That's an interesting point. So you could think of the fear or like the arousal as feeding back into the validity of the abduction.
Yeah, as a data point.
I'm feeling this way, which would lend support to my conclusion that something's not right here. Yeah. So you get it's almost like you can also think of it like as these like gut. You could probably think of these almost like gut reactions, where it's like, oh, something's not fitting together here.
And the gut reactions. The gut reactions would be like the intuitive. That would be like system one sort of stuff. Yeah. Right.
So you can maybe have abductive happening intuitively by saying there's a pattern disruption here that I'm perceiving.
Yeah.
Which causes that's weird.
Yeah. That's right. So it supports your thesis that it's actually an integration of system one and system two information.
Right. Yeah. And you don't have to have, what's interesting and potentially quite useful about this is you could see even in his explanation, it's like, it's not like deductive where you come to a specific conclusion. It's kind of open-ended. It doesn't point to anything in particular. It's like something's not right. Something's going on. This doesn't make sense. I need to do more investigating. I need to try and come up with an explanation reason as to why these two things, don't quite fit together. So it's not conclusive, which is fascinating.
But it leads to further investigation, which is certainly very good. Okay, Jeff, I think we should end it there. What do you say?
All right, that sounds good.
All right, until next time.
Okay,
talk to you later.
Dan. See ya.